Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm about to begin the process of going into a brand new class. This is a class for the fall 2018 semester at Rankin Technical College. The class is .NET Framework with Web Databases, AWD1111. Before we do that, though, let's talk about, before we talk about where we're going, let's talk about where we've been. So, in the first semester of the program, students took AWD1111 Web Development Technologies. Now, I'm not going to read that to you, all right? But I do want to mention that some of the stuff that's actually not mentioned in here, for instance, we talked about jQuery, which is a JavaScript library, and we talked about the Bootstrap framework, also known as Twitter Bootstrap, which makes it a little bit easier for you to set up a web page. The reason I'm bringing those up is that both Bootstrap and jQuery will, for lack of better words, rear their ugly head again in the AWD1111 class. All right? In the second semester, students went through the AWD1100 Programming Fundamentals with C# class, where they learned how to create C# programs. What I like to tell students is that, in my humble opinion, this class that you're going to take now, AWD1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases, in a way, is a hybrid. It's sort of a combination of what you learned in the first two classes. Now, if I have done my job the way that I should, by the time you finish with this class, you will know how to use ASP.NET and C# together to create database-driven websites. More than anything else, that's what this course is about. So we will talk about ASP.NET, all right? We'll talk about data access, deployment, distribution, etc., but more than anything else, we will talk about how to use ASP.NET in correlation or in conjunction with C# to create database-driven websites. Then in the spring semester, you're going to be learning the Java programming language, and then afterwards how to create Android applications. All right? But I just wanted to bring that in. So, what I'd like to tell you regarding that, and just so you see this, is what I'm going to go over right now are kind of the 7 tenets, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to go over what I plan on going over in the class. All right, I'm going to start with this, and you'll notice that it's numbered 01 through 03, 04, 05, 06, and 07. All right, in this particular lecture, we're not bad at all on time. We're at 3 minutes, but I'm going to go over what's in 01 here. What is that? It is an article, and it's old. It's back from 2010. But it's called MVC for Noobs. MVC is kind of the hallmark of this class that we're starting right now. MVC is an acronym that stands for Model View Controller. So as the author says in this article, we'll clarify what MVC means and why it has become so popular. All right? So it's MVC for Noobs, short for newbies, etc. Now, as you'll see here, it's not a new concept. It was first described in 1979, which makes it almost 40 years old. All right, I'm not going to go through and read from the article. That's not my goal for this. All right, but I do want to, because I like some of the stuff that was explained in here, such as what you see here on the second page. All right. Now, again, you can read what that says. Guess what? You've already started to learn how to separate responsibilities. Back in the AWD1000 Web Development Technologies class, you first learned about HTML and HTML5, the hypertext markup language, which you use to create web page content. After that, we learned about CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, which was used to style that content. Then after that, we got into working with JavaScript, which was used to add interactivity to a website, web page, website. So what we ended up doing in that class was separating, and we put our content into our .html files, our presentation into our .css files, and our interactivity into our .js files. There was a clear separation of responsibilities. In much the same way, you start to see this in the model view controller. All right. Now I'm going to mention it in the order they have it here. But quite often you hear people, when they talk about MVC, they first talk about the controller aspect. All right. But let's just take it, as they showed here from the top. The model handles the data and the business logic. What does all that mean? What you end up typically doing in an MVC application most of the time, I mean, you can't say all of the time about anything, but most of the time in an MVC or a model view controller application, you're going to have a database component. And if it's not going to be a database, you'll be working with data in some form or other, whether it's in a spreadsheet, a CSV text file, whatever it is. But quite often, it will be using a database. All right? When you work with the model part of MVC, for lack of better words, you have two ways that you can set up your data and your database. You can do what's called database first, or you can do what's called code first. Now, we'll talk about these in the class, but just to give you kind of a little prelude, with database first, you create the database, typically using SQL Server, but it doesn't have to be. All right? So you create the database first, and then you create different C#, ASP.NET classes to operate on that data. Those classes will constitute basically the business logic. Sometimes people get confused with terms like business logic or business rules. So let's very quickly go over them. I work at a technical college. All right? For people to be able to take classes at this technical college for credit in the hopes of getting an associate's degree, they have to pay money. That's a business rule of the college. All right? We're a private college. And I think we're a non-for-profit organization, but we need money to survive. All right? So that would be an example of a business rule. A business rule might say something like, these are our office hours. You can buy things 24 hours a day if you use our website, etc. All right? That's what the model handles. Then we come to the view. And the view is what the person using the application sees. It's typically going to be the HTML or hypertext markup language that gets returned to the user. So it says there, present data to the user in any supported format and layout. It doesn't have to be HTML, but quite often it is. So you've got your model that handles your database and the classes that will implement your business rules. You've got your view, which gives the data back to the user. And then you've got your controller. Your controller has a lot of responsibilities. In many ways, the controller is like either a traffic cop to make sure that the traffic flows to and fro, etc., in the right way, or a conductor. When you think of a conductor for an orchestra, typically, she or he is standing in front of the orchestra with a baton in their hand, telling certain types of instruments when to come in, when to not come in, how loud to be, etc. So in other words, their responsibility is not to play the instruments, but to tell the correct instrument when it's time to come in or not come in. In much the same way, the controller in the model view controller receives the request that the user enters into his or her address bar and then calls the appropriate resources, typically the right model or model class, to carry out whatever it is that has to be carried out. Then it gets that information back from the model class and it sends it out to the view. So the model and view, at least ideally, never converse directly with one another. The only conversation, so to speak, that takes place between the model and the view is done through the controller. So the controller, again, is the middle person that makes sure that the model can do its job and the view can do its job. So it says the application is divided into these three main components with each one in charge of a different task. Let's see a detailed explanation and an example. So that was my verbiage. Here's the verbiage in this particular article. All right? So notice here we are starting with a controller. As I already mentioned to you, the controller manages the user requests. Notice, and this was also on the previous page, its main function is to call the particular code to do the job and coordinate any communication that has to take place between the model and the view. Remember again, the model and the view should not ever directly communicate with one another. Rather, they should communicate with one another through the controller. Usually the controller will call the appropriate model for the task and then grab the proper view and return it to the user. The model. Notice the model is both the data. As I mentioned, it's typically a database, but it doesn't have to be. And the rules or business rules that apply to that data. In any software system, everything is modeled as data. All right? The model gives the controller a data representation of whatever it has been requested. The model contains the logic that applies to the problem that is being dealt with. Then there's the view. And as it says here, the view provides the way to present the data received from the model through the controller. So as it says, a web application, typically an MVC web application, which is what we'll be dealing with in this class, is composed of a set of controllers, models, and views. Again, the controller, as it says, may be structured as a main controller. All right? Now, I don't expect all of this to totally make sense to you where you say, oh, yeah, I understand every bit of that. You might not. And you know what? Either way, it's okay because you're going to get 18 weeks of this where you're going to hear more and more and more. Now, next in here is this section that says, let's see an example. We are going to look at it, but I will tell you that in the example that they show right here, and there's absolutely nothing wrong, nothing at all wrong with their example. But in this example, they're using the PHP programming language. We are using ASP.NET. All right? So our stuff will typically be called something like books underscore controller dot, for example, they could be .cs, could be .aspx, etc. Don't let that worry you one way or the other. What we're talking about here are concepts, and conceptually, this is how a model view controller application would work. So the author says here, suppose we're developing an online bookstore. The user can perform actions such as view books, register, buy, add items, etc. So let's see what happens when the user clicks on the fantasy category to view the titles that are available. It says we have a controller that's going to handle all book-related actions. So in other words, the user comes in and asks to look at a certain type of book, all right, or edit. Might be they want to buy a book or whatever, create. Maybe it's a library and they want to bring a book in, or delete. Maybe a book is old, all right. It says let's call it books controller for this example, and we'll also have a book model to handle the data and the logic required for you to be able to shop. All right. Finally, we'll have a series of views to present. So it says here the following figure shows how the user request to view something is handled. So the user comes in and makes a request. That request has to be handled by the controller. The controller goes and it calls the corresponding model class. That model class most often will have to call a database someplace. That database will return information to the model. That information from the model will be returned to the controller. The controller will feed that information then into the view, which will massage it and give back whatever the user needs back to the controller, which will send it back to the user. It may or may not look complex, but it's how it works. And each part of this has a job to do. Again, the controller not only grabs the request when it comes in, but it figures out which model to call. It grabs that model data and sends it to the view, and it grabs the view that's sent back from the view and sends it back to the user. Now, that's my way of going through this. I'm not going to read what's on this page here where it starts with the controller, etc. I'm going to jump down to what are the advantages, because I gave you my take, so to speak, on how this is. Again, you may or may not agree, and either way, that's okay. So what are the advantages? The biggest advantage is what we already mentioned, the fact that you separate your presentation from your application logic. Now, I do want to say this to you. There is nothing that prevents you from having the model talk directly to the view, or the view to the model. Or the model, for example, should never ever have anything to do with data presentation. So in other words, formatting, etc. But you can do it. You shouldn't do it when you use true MVC. As it says here, there is a clear separation. The model has its job, and that's what it does. The view has its job, and that's what it does. The controller has its job, and that's what it does. All right, and that's kind of what they're saying here. Apart from isolating the view from the business logic, the MVC separation reduces the complexity when designing large applications. The code is more structured, and it's easier to maintain, test, and reuse. Now, that may make very little sense to you right now. And you know what? Again, that's fine. That's what this class is going to be all about. All right? So it says, okay, but why a framework? Well, let's do two things. First of all, I'm going to come out here and I'm going to go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia.org. Kind of an online encyclopedia if you've never used it before. First, I'm going to type in Model View Controller. I'm not going to go over a lick of this. I like this picture. All right, I do like the picture, except for the fact that this picture basically implies that the model communicates directly with the view, which it should not do. All right, but there's some good stuff in here. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to type in here is framework. All right, so let's see. How about computer programming? All right. So it says in computer programming, a software framework is an abstraction in which software providing generic functionality can be selectively changed by additional user-written code, thus providing application-specific software. The only reason that I showed you this is the actual definition of a framework, a software framework, varies depending on who you ask. All right. So it says here software frameworks may include support programs, compilers, etc., even APIs, which is an application program interface. Frameworks have key distinguishing features. First, it says an inversion of control. I like the way they've got this drop down in here now. All right. Extensibility, where you can extend something. But if I come through here and I type in software framework defined, notice there's Wikipedia right there. Here's Stack Overflow. Somebody please explain to me what a software framework is. It says it's difficult to tell what is being asked here. The question is ambiguous, vague, incomplete, overly broad, or rhetorical. All right. It says here, using an MVC framework prevents me from making spaghetti code. It isolates the logic in the controllers and the presentation in the views. That's not even true. The logic should be in the models. All right. All right. I don't know if this is good or not. Again, there are plenty of things that you can type in, kind of like Techopedia, because they typically gives you short little definitions. So let's see what this says. A software framework is a concrete or conceptual platform where common code with generic functionality can be selectively specialized or overridden for development by users. All right, well, again, what does that mean? Well, you can look at it that the MVC pattern, the model view control pattern, represents a framework. You may agree with that. You may not agree with that. All right. The author says here, when you use a framework, the basic structure for MVC is already prepared. What you're going to see when we get into this is once we set up an MVC program, even an empty one, all right, unless it's completely empty, we'll have some stuff set up for us. We'll have a models folder, a views folder, a controllers folder, etc. So you'll see that as we go on. All right, and they're showing a little of that in here. Again, this is PHP, so it doesn't really pay to go over that. So, to conclude here, the author says, we have learned what is probably the most commonly used architectural pattern today. We have seen the advantages of using an MVC framework that provides us with a skeleton and a lot of functionality and that separation. That's what I wanted to get across in here. No, I'm not going to save that. All right. Next, and I'm going to probably, as I was looking at this, move this around a little. I'm going to add another one down here. But next, I'm going to very quickly look at an ASP.NET MVC overview. This will probably be a fairly short little lecture. I'll be back with that in just a couple minutes.